The sound of the whip cutting through the morning air echoed across the cotton fields of Rosewood Plantation like a clock marking the time of oppression. It was March 1852 in Natchez County, Mississippi, and each crack represented another mark on the already scarred backs of the men and women who labored under the scorching southern sun. Among these people was a young man of 25, whose name would soon become whispered in both fear and reverence throughout the plantation quarters: Isaiah Thornfield. Isaiah stood 6 feet tall, his muscular frame carved by years of back-breaking labor in the cotton fields. His dark skin bore the telltale scars of countless lashings, each one a testament to his refusal to be completely broken by the system that had claimed ownership of his body but never his spirit. His eyes, deep brown like the Mississippi soil after rain, held a fire that burned brighter with each passing day of bondage. The Rosewood Plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime Mississippi Delta land, owned by Edmund Whitmore, a man whose cruelty had become legendary even among the brutal plantation owners of the antebellum South. Whitmore had inherited the plantation from his father at the age of 30, and in the 15 years since, he had transformed what was once a moderately profitable cotton operation into one of the most productive and most feared plantations in the state. If you believe this story needs to be told, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below where you are watching this video. The plantation's main house stood like a white monument to wealth built on human suffering, its grand columns and wraparound porches a stark contrast to the cramped slave quarters that housed nearly 200 enslaved men, women, and children. These quarters consisted of small windowless cabins made of rough-hewn logs, each housing multiple families who had learned to find comfort in shared misery and whispered dreams of freedom. Isaiah's cabin was no different from the others, except for one detail that would prove crucial to the events that would unfold. Beneath the floorboards, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a collection of tools he had been secretly gathering for months. These weren't farming implements, though they might appear so to a casual observer. They were weapons, carefully selected and hidden away for a purpose that Isaiah had been planning since the day he watched his younger sister Sarah sold away to a plantation in Alabama 2 years prior. Sarah had been only 16 when the slave traders took her screams echoing across the plantation yard as Isaiah was held back by 4 overseers, their hands like iron shackles preventing him from reaching her. That day, something fundamental had shifted inside Isaiah. The acceptance that had allowed him to endure years of bondage transformed into something far more dangerous, a burning desire for justice that would not be extinguished by threats, beatings, or even death itself. The plantation operated under a hierarchy of cruelty that began with Edmund Whitmore and cascaded down through his overseers, drivers, and even some of the house slaves who had been corrupted by small privileges. At the top of this brutal pyramid, just below Whitmore himself, stood Marcus Grimsby, the head overseer whose reputation for violence had earned him the nickname the Devil's Right Hand among the enslaved population. Grimsby was a tall, lean man in his 40s, whose pale skin had been burned red by years under the Mississippi sun. His most distinguishing feature was a jagged scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a souvenir from a knife fight in a New Orleans tavern. He carried a coiled bullwhip at his belt like a gunslinger carried a pistol, and he used it with the same deadly precision. Under Grimsby served 3 other overseers: Thomas Briggs, a former soldier whose military background had taught him to view the enslaved population as enemy combatants to be controlled through fear; William Crenshaw, a local poor white who had found in his position a way to feel superior to someone, anyone, in the rigid social hierarchy of the antebellum South; and Samuel Hooks, the youngest of the group at 28, whose enthusiasm for violence often exceeded even Grimsby's appetite for cruelty. But Isaiah's focus extended beyond just the white overseers. He had also identified the slave drivers, enslaved men who had been given authority over their fellow bondsmen in exchange for slightly better treatment and small privileges. Chief among these was a man named Josiah Creek, a 40-year-old who had earned Whitmore's trust by consistently exceeding cotton quotas, often by driving his fellow slaves to the point of collapse. Creek lived in a slightly larger cabin and received better food, but he paid for these privileges with the hatred of nearly everyone in the quarters. The daily routine at Rosewood began before dawn with the clanging of the plantation bell, a sound that pulled the enslaved from whatever brief respite sleep provided. They would emerge from their cabins like ghosts in the pre-dawn darkness, moving toward the fields with the mechanical precision of people whose spirits had been ground down by years of repetitive labor. Isaiah worked primarily in the cotton fields, but his size and strength had also made him valuable for other tasks around the plantation. He had helped construct several of the newer buildings, including an expansion to the overseer's quarters and a new storage barn. This construction work had given him access to parts of the plantation that most field hands never saw, and more importantly, it had taught him the layout of every building, every entrance and exit, every hiding place that might prove useful when the time came. Among the enslaved population, Isaiah had carefully identified those who might be trusted with his growing plans for resistance. There was Martha Washington, a 50-year-old woman who worked as a cook in the main house and whose position gave her access to information about Whitmore's movements and plans. Martha had lost 3 children to slave sales over the years, and the grief had crystallized into a cold hatred that made her a valuable ally. Then there was Samuel Big Sam Johnson, a giant of a man who worked as the plantation blacksmith. Sam's position required him to repair tools, shoe horses, and maintain the ironwork throughout the plantation. His access to metalworking tools and his intimate knowledge of every piece of iron on the property made him indispensable to any plan that might require weapons or the means to break chains and locks. There was also Rebecca Mills, a 22-year-old woman who worked as a seamstress and laundress. Rebecca's beauty had unfortunately attracted the attention of several white men on the plantation, including Thomas Briggs, whose advances she had been forced to endure in silence. Her position in the laundry gave her access to the personal belongings of the overseers and plantation family, including their clothes, which often contained items of value or importance. Finally, there was Joshua Blackwood, an elderly man in his 60s, who served as the plantation's unofficial historian and keeper of stories. Joshua had been born into slavery and had seen the rise and fall of multiple overseers and even previous plantation owners. His knowledge of the land, the people, and the patterns of plantation life made him an invaluable source of strategic information. These 5 people, along with Isaiah, formed the core of what would become known in whispered conversations as the Circle. They met in secret, usually in the depths of the plantation's cypress swamp, where the thick canopy of trees and Spanish moss provided cover from prying eyes, and the sounds of their conversations were masked by the croaking of frogs and the splash of alligators moving through the dark water. The swamp had always been a place of refuge for the enslaved population at Rosewood. It was here that runaway slaves could hide for days or even weeks before attempting to make their way north. And it was here that the old African traditions and stories were kept alive through whispered tales and secret ceremonies. The overseers rarely ventured into the swamp, partly because of the very real dangers it posed: venomous snakes, alligators, and treacherous mud that could swallow a man whole, but also because of the superstitious fear that had grown up around it among the white population. Isaiah had chosen this location for the Circle's meetings, not just for its practical advantages, but because he understood the psychological power of the place. In the swamp, surrounded by the ancient cypress trees that had stood since before the first Europeans set foot on American soil, the enslaved could remember that they were connected to something older and more enduring than the institution that currently held them captive. The meetings of the Circle had begun 3 months earlier, in December of 1851, shortly after Isaiah had received devastating news through the plantation's informal communication network. Sarah, his sister, who had been sold to Alabama, had died of fever in a plantation hospital where enslaved workers received minimal medical care. The news had reached him through a chain of kitchen workers, field hands, and traveling preachers who maintained connections between plantations across the South. Sarah's death had been the final catalyst that transformed Isaiah's simmering resentment into a focused plan for action. No longer was he content to simply endure and hope for eventual freedom. He had decided that if he was going to die, and he understood that his plans would likely lead to his death, he would die fighting, and he would take as many of his oppressors with him as possible. But Isaiah was not a man driven purely by vengeance. His intelligence, sharpened by years of careful observation and self-education, had taught him that random violence would accomplish nothing except his own swift execution. What he envisioned was something far more systematic, a coordinated strike that would cripple the plantation's ability to function and send a message that would ripple across the South. The plan that Isaiah had been developing was ambitious in scope and meticulous in detail. It involved not just the killing of the overseers, though that was certainly a central component, but also the liberation of the plantation's enslaved population, the destruction of key infrastructure, and the seizure of weapons and supplies that could sustain a prolonged resistance. The timing of the planned uprising had been carefully chosen. Isaiah had learned through Martha's intelligence gathering that Whitmore was planning to travel to New Orleans in late March for a cotton buyers' convention. This would remove the plantation owner from the scene for at least a week, leaving only the overseers and drivers to maintain control. Additionally, March was the season when the cotton had been harvested and sold, meaning that the plantation's cash reserves would be at their highest, providing resources that could fund an escape to the north, or even passage to Liberia for those who chose that option. As Isaiah walked through the fields that morning in March 1852, his hoe moving mechanically through the soil as he prepared the ground for another year's cotton crop, his mind was not on the work at hand. Instead, he was reviewing every detail of the plan that would soon transform Rosewood Plantation from a monument to oppression into a symbol of resistance that would be remembered long after the last cotton plant had withered in its fields. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the heat began to build as it would throughout the day until the fields became furnaces that tested the limits of human endurance. Sweat began to bead on Isaiah's forehead, but his expression remained calm and focused. In just 2 weeks, when the moon was new and the nights were at their darkest, the circle would put their plan into motion. But first, there was more work to be done, more intelligence to be gathered, and more allies to be recruited. For Isaiah understood that what they were planning was not just an act of personal vengeance, but the opening shot in a war for the very soul of what America claimed to represent. The contradiction between the nation's founding ideals of freedom and equality and the reality of human bondage that supported its economic prosperity could not continue indefinitely. As the morning wore on and the overseer's voice could be heard shouting orders across the fields, Isaiah allowed himself a small smile. Marcus Grimsby had no idea that the young man working quietly in the cotton field was counting the steps between the overseer's horse and the tree line, measuring distances, calculating angles, and planning the moment when the whip would finally be turned against those who had wielded it for so long. The day was coming when the enslaved would no longer bow their heads in submission, when the quarters would no longer echo with the sound of weeping, and when the name Isaiah Thornfield would be spoken not in whispered fear, but in proud remembrance of the moment when the oppressed finally stood up and said, "No more." The 2 weeks that followed passed with agonizing slowness for Isaiah, each day bringing him closer to the moment that would either secure their freedom or seal their doom. The routine of plantation life continued its relentless rhythm, but beneath the surface, the circle had begun to set their plan in motion with the careful precision of clockwork. Martha Washington had proven invaluable in her role as intelligence gatherer. Working in the main house kitchen, she overheard conversations between Whitmore and his overseers, learned the schedules of patrols, and most importantly, confirmed that the plantation owner would indeed depart for New Orleans on March 20th, just as Isaiah had hoped. More crucially, she discovered that Whitmore planned to take Thomas Briggs with him as security, reducing the number of overseers on the plantation from 4 to 3. "Master Whitmore don't trust leaving all that cotton money unguarded on the road," Martha whispered to Isaiah during one of their clandestine meetings in the swamp. "He's taking Briggs and 2 of his hunting dogs. That leaves just Grimsby, Crenshaw, and young Hooks to watch over 200 souls." This news had required a significant adjustment to their plans. Briggs had been one of Isaiah's primary targets, the man whose brutality toward Rebecca Mills had earned him a special place on the list of those who would face justice. But his absence also presented an opportunity. With one fewer overseer to deal with, their chances of success had improved considerably. Big Sam Johnson had been equally productive in his preparations. Using his position as the plantation blacksmith, he had been secretly forging weapons from scrap metal and broken tools. Working late into the night by the dim light of his forge, he had created a dozen crude but effective blades, each one carefully hidden in different locations around the plantation. More importantly, he had weakened several key pieces of infrastructure that would prove crucial when the time came. "I've been filing through the hinges on the overseer quarters door," Sam reported during another nighttime gathering. "Not enough to make them fall off, but enough that one good kick will send that door flying. And I've loosened the iron bars on the plantation jail. They'll pull right out of the wall when we need them to." The plantation jail was a small, windowless building where rebellious slaves were held for punishment. It currently housed 2 men, Abraham Foster, who had been caught trying to learn to read, and Daniel Cross, who had talked back to William Crenshaw during a particularly brutal beating. Both men had been identified as potential allies, and their liberation would be one of the first acts of the uprising. Rebecca Mills had taken on perhaps the most dangerous task of all. Using her position in the laundry, she had been gradually stealing items from the overseer's personal belongings. A key here, a small amount of money there, and most importantly, she had managed to obtain a detailed map of the local area from William Crenshaw's coat pocket. The map showed not only the plantation boundaries, but also the locations of neighboring plantations, roads, and most crucially, the routes that runaway slaves typically used to head north. Crenshaw keeps this folded up in his jacket pocket, Rebecca had explained, her hands trembling slightly as she showed the map to the others. He uses it when he's tracking runaways, but now we can use it to plan our escape routes. The map revealed something that none of them had known. There was an abandoned ferry crossing just 5 miles north of the plantation, hidden in a bend of the Mississippi River. If they could reach it, they would have access to boats that could carry them across the river into Louisiana, and from there, they could follow established underground railroad routes toward freedom. Joshua Blackwood, meanwhile, had been working to expand their network of allies beyond the original circle. His decades of experience on the plantation had taught him to read people with an accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. He could identify those who were ready to risk everything for freedom, and just as importantly, those who might betray them out of fear or misguided loyalty to their masters. "Young Marcus Freeman is ready," Joshua reported one evening, referring to a 20-year-old field hand whose father had been sold away the previous year. "He's got fire in his belly and steady hands. And there's Patience Cole. She works in the nursery with the slave children. She knows every hiding place on this plantation, and more importantly, she knows which children are old enough to run and which ones would slow us down." But Joshua also brought disturbing news. "Josiah Creek has been asking questions," he said, his weathered face creased with worry. "He's been sniffing around, trying to figure out why certain folks have been whispering more than usual. We need to be careful, or we need to deal with him before he can cause trouble." Josiah Creek represented one of the most challenging aspects of their plan. As a slave driver who had bought his relatively comfortable position by betraying his fellow bondsmen, Creek had everything to lose if the plantation's power structure collapsed. He was also one of the few enslaved people who had regular contact with the overseers, making him a significant threat to their security. Isaiah had wrestled with the question of what to do about Creek for weeks. On one hand, the man was as much a victim of slavery as anyone else in the quarters. His collaboration was a survival strategy in an impossible situation. On the other hand, his betrayal of the uprising could result in the deaths of everyone Isaiah cared about. "We give him one chance," Isaiah finally decided. "Joshua, you approach him carefully. Find out if he's truly loyal to Whitmore or if he's just scared. If he's willing to join us, we welcome him. If he's not, then we make sure he can't interfere with what we're doing." If this story has captured your attention so far, leave your like, subscribe to the channel and share this video. The recruitment of new allies had proceeded slowly but steadily. Marcus Freeman proved to be exactly what Joshua had promised: eager, brave, and utterly committed to the cause. His youth made him valuable for tasks that required speed and agility, and his knowledge of the plantation's hidden paths and secret routes made him an ideal scout and messenger. Patience Cole brought skills that none of the others possessed. Her work with the children had taught her to move silently, to comfort the frightened, and to organize complex activities without drawing attention. More importantly, she had identified which of the plantation's children were old enough to be included in the escape plans and which families would need to make the heartbreaking decision to leave young ones behind. "The Henderson family has 5 children, she reported during one of their meetings. "Little Mary is only 3. She won't be able to keep up if we're moving fast, but James Henderson is torn between leaving her or staying and facing whatever comes. We need to have a plan for situations like this." This had led to one of the most difficult discussions the circle had faced. The reality was that a large group moving with small children would be easier to track and catch than a smaller, faster group of adults. But abandoning children went against everything they believed in. The solution they eventually reached was to create multiple escape routes and groups, allowing families to make their own choices based on their circumstances. As the days passed and March 20th approached, the tension in the slave quarters became almost palpable. Those who knew about the planned uprising moved through their daily routines with forced normalcy, while those who remained unaware sensed that something was different but couldn't identify what had changed. The overseers, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the storm that was brewing beneath their feet. Marcus Grimsby continued his daily rounds, with the same brutal efficiency he had always displayed, unaware that every movement he made was being observed and catalogued by eyes that no longer looked away in submission. William Crenshaw maintained his routine of random violence and humiliation, never noticing that his victims no longer flinched quite as much as they once had. Samuel Hooks continued to take pleasure in the suffering of others, blind to the fact that some of those he tormented were now planning to return that suffering tenfold. The most challenging aspect of the preparation period was maintaining the appearance of normalcy while conducting the detailed planning that their success would require. The circle had to communicate using a complex system of signals and coded language that could convey crucial information without arousing suspicion. A certain way of hanging clothes on the line meant that a meeting was scheduled. The number of eggs Martha collected from the chicken coop indicated whether Whitmore's travel plans remained unchanged. The pattern of sparks from Big Sam's forge told those who knew how to read them whether weapons production was on schedule, but it was Rebecca who uncovered the intelligence that would prove most crucial to their success. While washing William Crenshaw's shirts, she had discovered a letter in his pocket from the county sheriff, outlining new patrol schedules designed to prevent slave escapes. The letter revealed that the local authorities had received reports of increased unrest among the enslaved population in the region, and were planning to increase their vigilance starting in early April. "They suspect something," Rebecca reported breathlessly during an emergency meeting called in the depths of the swamp. "Not specifically about us, but they know something is stirring. The sheriff is planning to double the slave patrols starting April 1st. If we're going to move, it has to be before then." This news forced Isaiah to accelerate their timeline. Originally, he had planned to wait until Whitmore had been gone for several days, allowing the overseers to settle into a routine without their master's oversight. But with increased patrols coming and the risk of discovery growing with each passing day, they would need to act on the very night of Whitmore's departure. The final piece of preparation involved creating detailed contingency plans for everything that could go wrong. What if one of the overseers didn't follow his expected routine? What if Josiah Creek betrayed them at the last minute? What if some of the enslaved population panicked and fled in the wrong direction? What if the weather turned bad and made travel difficult? Isaiah had insisted on planning for every possible scenario, understanding that the difference between success and failure might come down to how quickly they could adapt when their original plans encountered the chaos of reality. Each member of the circle had been assigned specific responsibilities and backup assignments in case their primary role became impossible to fulfill. Martha would be responsible for drugging the evening meals served to the overseers. Using a combination of laudanum and other substances, she had been carefully accumulating from the plantation's medical supplies. Big Sam would disable the plantation bell that was used to summon help in emergencies, ensuring that even if the overseers managed to call for assistance, their cries would not carry beyond the immediate vicinity. Rebecca would secure the weapons cache and distribute them to the designated fighters. Joshua would coordinate the evacuation of non-combatants, particularly the elderly and infirm, who would need help reaching safety. Isaiah himself would lead the strike team that would neutralize the overseers before they could organize any resistance. This was the most dangerous part of the entire operation, requiring split-second timing and absolute commitment. There would be no opportunity for hesitation or mercy. The overseers had to be eliminated quickly and decisively, or the entire uprising would collapse in a bloodbath that would doom everyone involved. As March 19th dawned, the final day before Whitmore's departure, Isaiah found himself walking through the plantation with new eyes. Every building, every tree, every path looked different now that he knew this might be the last day he would see them as a slave. Tomorrow night, he would either be a free man heading north toward liberty, or he would be dead, his body serving as a warning to any other enslaved person who might dare to dream of resistance. The irony was not lost on him that after years of dreaming about this moment, he found himself almost nostalgic for the certainty of bondage. Life as a slave was brutal and dehumanizing, but it was also predictable. Tomorrow night would bring them into completely uncharted territory, where their survival would depend entirely on their own courage, intelligence, and the hope that somewhere in this vast and hostile country there were people willing to help them reach freedom. As evening approached and the plantation settled into its nightly routine, Isaiah made his final rounds of the slave quarters, speaking quietly with each member of their expanded network. No dramatic speeches were needed. They all understood what tomorrow night would bring and what would be required of each of them. The time for words had passed. Now everything depended on action. The last person Isaiah spoke with was Martha, who pressed a small cloth bundle into his hands. Inside was a piece of cornbread and some dried meat, provisions for the journey that would begin tomorrow night. But wrapped in the food was something even more precious, a small piece of paper on which Martha had carefully written the words, "For Sarah," in the careful script she had taught herself in secret moments stolen from her endless labor. Isaiah looked at the paper for a long moment, then folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. Tomorrow night, when he struck the first blow against their oppressors, he would be fighting not just for his own freedom, but for the memory of his sister, and for every other person who had suffered and died under the lash. The time for submission was ending, and the time for justice was about to begin. March 20th arrived with a crimson dawn that painted the sky the color of blood, an omen that Isaiah chose to interpret as a sign of the justice that would finally be served. Edmund Whitmore departed the plantation at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, his carriage loaded with cotton samples and ledgers, accompanied by Thomas Briggs and 2 armed guards. As the dust cloud from their departure settled over the main road, Isaiah felt a surge of grim satisfaction. The first phase of their plan had succeeded. They now faced only 3 overseers instead of 4. The day passed with excruciating slowness, each hour feeling like an eternity, as Isaiah and his conspirators went through the motions of their daily labor, while their minds focused entirely on the night ahead. Marcus Grimsby seemed more irritable than usual, perhaps sensing the subtle change in atmosphere that had settled over the plantation, though he attributed it to the natural restlessness that sometimes occurred when the master was away. As the afternoon wore on, Martha began her most crucial task. Working in the main house kitchen, she prepared the evening meal for the 3 remaining overseers with special care. Into the stew that would be served to Grimsby, Crenshaw, and Hooks, she carefully mixed measured doses of laudanum and other sedatives she had been accumulating over the past weeks. The mixture was not enough to kill. That honor was reserved for more direct methods, but it would slow their reflexes and cloud their judgment when the moment of reckoning arrived. "The portions are ready," Martha whispered to Rebecca when she came to collect the laundry from the main house. "Grimsby gets the largest serving. He's the biggest threat. The young one, Hooks, gets the smallest. We need him awake enough to know what's happening to him." Big Sam had spent the day making his final preparations. Using his access to the plantation's metalwork, he had disabled the large bell that was used to summon help in emergencies, filing through the rope that connected it to its clapper. To anyone who looked, the bell appeared normal, but when pulled, it would produce only a faint clank instead of the thunderous alarm that could be heard for miles. He had also prepared the weapons cache, ensuring that each blade was sharp and ready for the work ahead. As darkness fell over Rosewood Plantation, the overseers settled into their evening routine, unaware that this would be their last night on Earth. Grimsby retired to his quarters after consuming a hearty portion of Martha's drugged stew, already feeling the effects of the sedatives as his eyelids grew heavy. Crenshaw spent the evening drinking whiskey on his porch, his usual habit made more dangerous by the substances now flowing through his bloodstream. Hooks, the youngest and most energetic of the 3, fought against the drowsiness longer than the others, but eventually succumbed to sleep around midnight. At precisely 1 o'clock in the morning, when the moon was hidden behind clouds and the plantation lay shrouded in darkness, Isaiah emerged from his cabin, carrying the tools of revolution he had hidden beneath his floorboards. The time for patience and planning was over. The time for action had begun. Moving with the silence of shadows, the members of the circle converged on their predetermined positions. Big Sam headed toward the overseer quarters, his massive frame barely visible in the darkness as he carried the keys Rebecca had stolen from Crenshaw's laundry. Martha moved toward the main house to ensure that no house slaves would interfere with their plans. Most were allies, but a few remained loyal to their masters out of fear or misguided gratitude. Rebecca and Patience Cole began the careful process of organizing the escape groups, moving through the slave quarters with whispered instructions and gentle touches that roused their allies without alerting those who might betray them. Joshua Blackwood positioned himself near the plantation jail, ready to free Abraham Foster and Daniel Cross, whose local knowledge would be valuable for the journey ahead. Isaiah himself moved toward Marcus Grimsby's quarters, his heart pounding with a mixture of rage and anticipation that had been building for months. In his hand, he carried a knife that Big Sam had forged specifically for this moment. A blade strong enough to pierce through bone and sharp enough to deliver justice with surgical precision. The overseer quarters stood in a row behind the main house, 3 modest but comfortable buildings, that represented luxury beyond the dreams of the enslaved population. Grimsby's quarters were the largest, befitting his status as head overseer, and they were here that Isaiah would strike the first blow of their revolution. The door to Grimsby's quarters opened silently, under Big Sam's sabotage. The hinges had been filed through just enough to allow the door to swing free with minimal pressure. Inside, the head overseer lay sprawled across his bed, his breathing deep and regular under the influence of Martha's chemical assistance. His bullwhip hung on a peg beside the bed, coiled like a sleeping serpent that had brought pain to countless backs. Isaiah stood over the man who had been the instrument of so much suffering, feeling a moment of profound clarity. This was not just about revenge, though revenge was certainly part of it. This was about justice, about balancing the scales that had been tilted toward cruelty for far too long. This was about ensuring that Marcus Grimsby would never again raise his hand against another human being. The knife descended with swift efficiency, piercing Grimsby's heart before the drugged overseer could even fully awaken. His eyes opened wide for just a moment, meeting Isaiah's gaze in the darkness, and in that brief instant, Isaiah saw recognition and understanding. Grimsby knew who was killing him and why, and that knowledge was the last thing he would ever possess. Meanwhile, Big Sam had moved to William Crenshaw's quarters, where the overseer had passed out drunk on his porch. The combination of alcohol and laudanum had left him completely defenseless, and Sam's massive hands made quick work of snapping his neck with a sharp twist that was both efficient and final. Crenshaw died without ever knowing that his reign of terror had come to an end. The third overseer, Samuel Hooks, proved to be more challenging. The sedatives had made him drowsy but not completely unconscious, and when Rebecca entered his quarters, he stirred and reached for the pistol he kept beside his bed. What followed was a brief but violent struggle that ended only when Joshua Blackwood appeared in the doorway and struck Hooks down with a heavy iron bar that Big Sam had provided for exactly this purpose. "It's done," Rebecca whispered, her hands shaking as she looked down at Hooks's still form. "They're all dead." But even as she spoke, a complication arose that threatened to derail their entire plan. From the direction of the slave quarters came the sound of shouting. Josiah Creek had discovered the escape preparations and was attempting to raise an alarm. "Stop!" Creek's voice echoed across the plantation yard. "Master Whitmore, the slaves are running! They've killed the overseers!" His cries would have brought disaster if not for the quick thinking of Marcus Freeman, who tackled Creek from behind and wrestled him to the ground. But the damage was done. The secrecy they had depended on was shattered, and now speed became more important than stealth. "Change of plans," Isaiah commanded, as he emerged from Grimsby's quarters, his knife still bloody from the night's work. "We move now, all of us together. No time for the organized groups. Everyone who's coming needs to leave immediately." What followed was controlled chaos, as nearly 60 enslaved people began their flight toward freedom. Not everyone chose to come. Some were too old or sick to make the journey. Others were too frightened to risk the certain death that would follow if they were caught. But those who did choose freedom moved with the desperate efficiency of people who understood that this was their only chance. The freed prisoners, Abraham Foster and Daniel Cross, proved invaluable as guides. Their recent experience with the plantation's punishment system had given them detailed knowledge of the patrol routes and security measures. They led the escaping slaves through paths that avoided the main roads and open fields, where they would be visible to pursuing horsemen. Martha had prepared packages of food and medical supplies that were distributed among the escapees as they fled. Rebecca carried the stolen map that would guide them to the abandoned ferry crossing, 5 miles north. Big Sam brought tools that could be used to break chains or defend against pursuit. Each person carried what they could, while moving as quickly as possible through the darkness. But their escape did not go unnoticed for long. A neighboring plantation owner, awakened by the sounds of commotion, sent riders to investigate. When they discovered the bodies of the 3 overseers and the empty slave quarters, alarm bells began ringing across the county. By dawn, search parties would be organized, bloodhounds would be unleashed, and a manhunt would begin that would test every aspect of Isaiah's planning and leadership. The group had reached the edge of the plantation property when they encountered their first pursuing force, a patrol of local militia that had been alerted by the alarm. What followed was a running battle through the forest, with Isaiah and his fighters providing rearguard action while the non-combatants continued toward the river crossing. "Stay together," Isaiah shouted over the gunfire. "Don't let them separate us. The combat was unlike anything Isaiah had ever experienced. Years of suppressed rage and frustration poured out in deadly efficiency as he and his fellow fighters used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver their pursuers. Trees that had provided shade during endless days of labor now offered cover from bullets. Streams that had been sources of water during brief rest periods now became barriers that slowed the mounted pursuers. Marcus Freeman proved himself to be a natural fighter, using his youth and agility to stay ahead of the patrol while providing accurate rifle fire from positions of concealment. Big Sam's size and strength made him a devastating close-quarters combatant when the fighting became hand-to-hand. Even Patience Cole, despite her role as a non-combatant, showed remarkable courage in helping wounded escapees continue their flight. But the most shocking revelation of the night came when Josiah Creek, the slave driver who had initially tried to betray them, appeared at Isaiah's side during the fighting. "I was wrong," Creek gasped, blood streaming from a wound on his forehead. "I was trying to protect what little I had, but I see now that it wasn't protection. It was just another kind of slavery. Let me fight with you." Isaiah looked at the man who had been his enemy just hours before, seeing in his eyes the same desperate hope that had driven Isaiah himself to plan this uprising. Without hesitation, he handed Creek one of their remaining weapons. "Fight for your freedom," Isaiah said simply. "Fight for all of us." The battle continued through the pre-dawn hours, with the escapees slowly but steadily making their way toward the river crossing. They had lost some people, some captured, some wounded too badly to continue, some who had simply vanished into the darkness, but the core group remained intact and determined. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, they finally reached the abandoned ferry crossing that Rebecca's stolen map had promised. There, hidden among the reeds and fallen logs, were 3 small boats that had been left behind when the official ferry service had moved to a more convenient location downstream. "This is it," Isaiah announced as he looked across the Mississippi River toward the Louisiana shore. "Once we cross this water, we're in different territory. The patrols won't be able to follow us as easily, and we'll have access to the underground railroad routes that can take us north." But even as he spoke, the sound of approaching horsemen could be heard in the distance. Their pursuers had not given up, and the final test of their escape was yet to come. The boats could carry them to safety, but first they had to survive long enough to reach them. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine whether Isaiah's revolution would end in freedom or in the catastrophic failure that would doom not just the escapees, but everyone who had ever dreamed of following in their footsteps. Everything they had planned, everything they had fought for, everything they had sacrificed, came down to the next few minutes on the banks of the Mississippi River. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats grew louder as Isaiah and his fellow escapees reached the muddy banks of the Mississippi River. Behind them, through the morning mist, they could see the torches of their pursuers cutting through the gray dawn like angry stars. The boats that represented their salvation bobbed gently in the current, but reaching them would require crossing 30 yards of open ground where they would be completely exposed to rifle fire. "How many boats?" Isaiah asked breathlessly, his chest heaving from the night-long flight and fighting. 3, Rebecca replied, her voice tight with exhaustion and fear. "But they're small, maybe 15 people in each if we pack tight." Isaiah quickly counted their numbers. 43 people had made it this far. Men, women and children, who had risked everything for this moment of potential freedom. The mathematics were grim but manageable if they could reach the boats before the militia arrived. "First boat takes the children and anyone who can't fight," Isaiah commanded. "Second boat takes the women and elderly. Third boat takes the men who can still hold weapons. Big Sam, you're in charge of the first boat. Get those children across that water no matter what happens here." The sound of their pursuers was growing closer, and Isaiah could now make out individual voices shouting orders through the trees. They had perhaps 5 minutes before the militia would break through the forest and have clear sightlines to the riverbank. Big Sam lifted the smallest children into the first boat with surprising gentleness for such a massive man, while Patience Cole organized the others with calm efficiency despite the approaching danger. Martha Washington, despite her age, insisted on waiting for the second boat so she could help with the wounded who had made it this far. "Martha, you should go with the first group," Isaiah urged, but the elderly cook shook her head firmly. "I've lived through enough to know when my time comes," she said with quiet dignity, "but these young ones need every chance we can give them. I'll take my turn when it comes." The first boat pushed off from the shore just as the advance scouts of the militia emerged from the tree line. Rifles cracked across the water, but the distance and the morning mist made accurate shooting difficult. Big Sam and the other adults in the boat used their bodies to shield the children as they paddled desperately toward the Louisiana shore. Isaiah watched the boat disappear into the mist with a mixture of relief and anguish. At least some of them would make it to freedom, regardless of what happened next. But the sight of those children, some no older than his sister Sarah had been when she was sold away, steeled his resolve for the fight that was about to begin. The second boat was loading when the main force of militia broke through the trees, their rifles ready and their fury evident even across the distance. These were not professional soldiers, but local plantation owners and poor whites who saw the slave uprising as a direct threat to their way of life. Their anger made them dangerous, but it also made them careless. "Fire at will!" shouted the militia captain, and a ragged volley of shots echoed across the water. Most went wide, but one bullet found its mark, striking Joshua Blackwood in the shoulder and spinning him around before he collapsed on the riverbank. "Joshua!" Isaiah rushed to the old man's side, but Joshua waved him away with his good arm. "Get the boats loaded," Joshua gasped, blood spreading across his shirt. "Don't waste time on an old man who's already lived longer than most of us get to." But Isaiah had no intention of leaving anyone behind. He and Marcus Freeman lifted Joshua between them and carried him toward the second boat, even as more rifle fire erupted from the tree line. Rebecca and several other women returned fire with weapons they had taken from the plantation, their shots more accurate than those of their pursuers due to their intimate knowledge of the terrain. The second boat pushed off with Martha Washington at the helm. Her years of experience managing the plantation kitchen now applied to managing a desperate river crossing. She organized the passengers with the same efficiency she had once used to feed hundreds of people, ensuring that weight was distributed properly and that everyone had a role to play in their escape. Isaiah watched the second boat disappear into the mist, then turned to face the militia with the dozen fighters who remained. They were outnumbered at least 3-1, but they had advantages that their enemies lacked. They were fighting for their lives and freedom rather than for the preservation of an unjust system, and they knew every rock and tree along this stretch of riverbank. "Spread out along the shore," Isaiah commanded. "Make them come at us one at a time through that narrow gap in the trees. And remember, every minute we hold them here gives the boats more time to reach safety." What followed was the most intense fighting of Isaiah's life. The militia charged forward with the confidence of men who had never faced serious resistance from enslaved people, only to discover that desperation and righteous anger could make even the most oppressed fighters formidable opponents. Marcus Freeman had positioned himself behind a fallen log and was picking off attackers with methodical precision, his young eyes sharp enough to find targets even in the dim light of dawn. Josiah Creek, the former slave driver who had redeemed himself through combat, fought with the fury of a man trying to atone for years of collaboration. Even some of the women who had missed the second boat joined the fighting, using knives and clubs with deadly effectiveness. But the most devastating fighter was Isaiah himself. Years of suppressed rage had transformed him into something beyond human, a force of nature that carved through the attacking militia like a blade through wheat. The knife that had killed Marcus Grimsby now found new targets, and Isaiah's intimate knowledge of human anatomy, gained through years of treating wounds inflicted by overseers, made every strike precisely lethal. The fighting raged for what felt like hours, but was probably no more than 20 minutes. When the smoke cleared and the last echoes of gunfire faded across the water, the riverbank was littered with bodies, most of them belonging to the militia that had pursued them. Isaiah and his fighters had paid a price for their victory, but they had held the crossing long enough for the boats to escape. The third boat, Rebecca called out, her voice hoarse from shouting orders during the battle. "It's time to go." But as they prepared to board the final boat, Isaiah made a decision that surprised even himself. He looked back toward the plantation they had fled, then at the bodies of their enemies scattered along the riverbank, and finally at the faces of his surviving companions. "I'm not going," he announced quietly. "What?" Marcus Freeman stared at him in disbelief. "Isaiah, this is what we fought for, freedom. The boat is right here." Isaiah shook his head slowly. "Freedom isn't just about escaping. It's about making sure that what we did here tonight means something. If I run north and hide, then in a few years people will say this was just another slave rebellion that failed. But if I stay and keep fighting, if I make them remember what happened at Rosewood Plantation, then maybe other people will find the courage to stand up too." Rebecca stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "You'll die if you stay. They'll hunt you down like an animal." "Maybe," Isaiah agreed, "but I've been dead for 25 years, dead in every way that matters. Tonight, For the first time in my life, I felt truly alive. I felt like a man instead of property. I won't give that up now, not even for freedom in some distant northern city. The debate might have continued, but the sound of approaching reinforcements made the decision urgent. Isaiah helped his remaining companions into the third boat, then pushed it away from shore with his own hands. "Tell them what happened here," he called out as the boat disappeared into the mist. "Tell them that we fought back and that we won. Tell them that Isaiah Thornfield chose to be free and that freedom is worth any price." What followed were 3 weeks that transformed Isaiah Thornfield from an escaped slave into a legend that would be whispered about in slave quarters across the South. Using the swamplands he knew intimately, he conducted a one-man guerrilla campaign against the institution of slavery, striking at isolated plantations, freeing enslaved people, and disappearing back into the wilderness before organized pursuit could find him. His reputation grew with each raid. Some said he could walk on water and turn bullets aside with his bare hands. Others claimed he was the ghost of every slave who had died under the lash, returned to exact vengeance on their oppressors. The truth was simpler but no less remarkable. He was a man who had discovered that dignity and freedom were worth more than life itself, and who fought with the clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. The authorities brought in professional slave catchers, bloodhounds, and eventually federal troops, but Isaiah always stayed one step ahead. His knowledge of the local terrain, combined with a network of sympathizers both enslaved and free, allowed him to continue his campaign far longer than anyone thought possible. But Isaiah knew that his time was limited. Each raid brought more attention, more resources devoted to capturing him, and fewer safe havens where he could rest and resupply. He also knew that his actions were inspiring others. Reports reached him of uprisings on plantations throughout Mississippi and Louisiana, each one citing his example as proof that resistance was possible. The end came, as Isaiah had always known it would, in a final confrontation where he chose to stand and fight rather than run, surrounded by federal troops in the same cypress swamp where he had once planned his revolution. Isaiah Thornfield made his last stand with the dignity and courage that had defined his brief time as a free man. He took 17 of his enemies with him before falling to their overwhelming numbers, and his last words, according to the federal report, were, "Tell my sister Sarah that her brother died free." But death was not the end of Isaiah's story. News of his uprising and the weeks of resistance that followed spread throughout the South, despite all efforts to suppress it. Enslaved people who had never heard of Rosewood Plantation knew the name Isaiah Thornfield and understood what it represented, proof that even the most oppressed people could find the strength to stand up and fight. The boats that had escaped that morning at the ferry crossing made it safely to freedom. Big Sam eventually settled in Detroit, where he established a blacksmith shop that became a crucial link in the Underground Railroad. Martha Washington lived to see the end of slavery, dying peacefully in 1867, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had been born free. Rebecca Mills became a teacher in a school for freed slaves, ensuring that future generations would learn to read and write the freedom that had been denied to her. Marcus Freeman joined the Union Army when the Civil War began, rising to the rank of sergeant and fighting in battles that helped bring about the end of slavery. Patience Cole established an orphanage for freed slave children, providing them with the care and education they needed to build new lives in freedom. The Rosewood Plantation itself was never rebuilt. Edmund Whitmore returned from New Orleans to find his overseers dead, his enslaved workforce gone, and his main house burned to the ground in the aftermath of Isaiah's campaign. Unable to recover financially, he eventually sold the land, which was later purchased by a consortium of former slaves who transformed it into a thriving community of free farmers. Years later, when the Civil War had ended and slavery was finally abolished, a monument was erected on the site where the overseer quarters had once stood. The inscription, carved by Big Sam himself, read simply, "Isaiah Thornfield and all who died for freedom. They chose to live as men, rather than exist as property." The story of Isaiah Thornfield became part of the oral tradition that sustained African American communities through the long struggle for civil rights. Parents told their children about the field worker who turned the whip against his oppressors, and those children grew up understanding that courage and dignity could triumph over even the most overwhelming odds. In the end, Isaiah's revolution succeeded in ways he could never have imagined, not just in the immediate liberation of dozens of enslaved people, but in the inspiration it provided to countless others who found in his example the strength to resist, to endure, and ultimately to overcome the system that had sought to reduce them to property. The name Isaiah Thornfield was remembered long after the names of his oppressors were forgotten, proof that even in the darkest times, there are those who will choose freedom over safety, dignity over survival, and justice over acceptance of injustice. His legacy lived on in every person who refused to bow down, every voice that spoke truth to power, and every act of resistance against oppression. The field worker who had turned the whip against his overseers had done more than seek personal vengeance. He had struck a blow for the fundamental principle that all human beings are born free and equal, regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. In choosing to fight rather than submit, Isaiah Thornfield had proved that the human spirit cannot be enslaved, no matter how heavy the chains or how brutal the punishment. And in plantations across the South, when the work was hardest and the overseers were cruelest, enslaved people would whisper his name and remember that freedom was not just a distant dream, but a choice that brave men and women could make regardless of the cost. The revolution that began at Rosewood Plantation continued in every heart that refused to accept that human bondage was the natural order of things, until finally, the institution of slavery itself could no longer withstand the accumulated weight of individual acts of resistance and courage. Isaiah Thornfield had died, as he had lived in his final weeks, as a free man who had chosen his own destiny. And in that choice, he had helped to light the flame that would eventually burn away the chains that bound an entire people, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply the refusal to accept that injustice is inevitable. If you enjoyed this narrative and want more stories like this, like the video, subscribe to the channel and comment the word freedom in the comments.